law and society. He gave a much briefer presentation based on this paper at the PAA meetings, and it was so interesting that I invited him to come give the full-bore version today. With that, I will hand it over to John. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. By full bore, I guess that means I don't have to talk like a New Yorker. I took 2 breaths, I think, during the 15-minute presentation at PAA. Segregation through the lens of housing transition is the talk that I'm giving here. Most people know that I study neighborhoods, how neighborhoods change over time. A lot of my work focuses on crime as one outcome, and that's just one way we can measure the quality of a neighborhood, what it's like. Is it good or bad? If I live in a neighborhood with little crime, that's better than having a lot of crime. But my research, because I'm interested in how neighborhoods change, a fundamental process of how neighborhoods change, of course, is people living in them and people who move in and move out of neighborhoods. So I'm naturally, part of my research gets pulled in this direction of residential mobility decisions. Some of my work has looked at segregation, because that ends up playing into that's kind of an outcome, one more outcome of the process. Some of my work has looked at how mobility decisions are affected by crime as well. This one is, this particular paper working on here is focused on residential mobility decisions, mostly looking at moving into the neighborhood. So again, if you think of segregation, segregation can only happen basically when at the level of the housing unit, when we see a transition, is the only way you're going to get to a segregated outcome. It takes over time, takes a process, but that's fundamentally what it takes to get there. So for my interest here, I'm interested in focusing on housing units. I'm going to be following the data set. I'm going to be using American Housing Survey, follows housing units over time. So it's a little different than other studies following longitudinal samples of people who they're following where the people move, which is interesting, but it's a different question. So here it's a focus on people moving into the unit. So the question, how do people choose what unit to move into? What is the process? Do people care about the racial ethnic composition? I'm not going to be focused here on trying to get at the perceptual sorts of things. There's a whole literature on that. I'm more just looking at some of the patterns and what we get from it. There's some interesting implications, I think, from some of those patterns that I'll talk about in a bit, that some of the perceptual information out there focused on a very small unit of analysis. I'm actually going to be using that small unit of analysis and showing how it captures part of the process, but not perhaps all of it. So when people make a decision where to move, what unit to move into, what are they looking at? If racial ethnic composition matters, that's a question we could even back up and ask. But if they're looking at that, what area are they looking at? Are they looking at some broader neighborhood? Of course, that's a mushy concept. That's something I work with a lot, and some of my work trying to get at, what is a neighborhood? How do we define what it is? But if you set that aside for a moment and say, well, there's some sense of a broader area, which is a neighborhood, is that what people look at? They look at the racial ethnic composition of that area and let that guide their decision. Or is it something much smaller? I refer to the micro-neighborhood composition. This term is mushy itself as well, but never mind. More and more, this idea is kind of popping up. Sometimes you see it referred to as the street block. Rick Granis has used that term a lot. The idea, basically, you can think of a street segment, both sides of the street, where bounded by intersections at either end, kind of a small area. In the suburbs, this is often what we think of as a block party. You see this real cohesiveness. Granis has done some work recently looking at the formation of what are referred to as neighborhood ties, neighborly ties, which is a vague concept in and of itself, but never mind. But there you see this real strong geographic bounding where people are much more likely to form ties with people next door to them, across the street, and then it decays really quickly. So again, that suggests that the local street really matters. And so maybe we would think when people make a decision on where to move to, that they're looking at the racial ethnic composition of the street. Or is it, do they look at the current residents, the racial ethnic composition of the household that they're moving into? This is something we're going to look at here. I've not seen much in the literature looking at this. But it's something we're going to consider as well in this paper here. How does segregation come about? This group here, I don't have to spend a lot of time, I would imagine, on this, but there's different theories out in the literature that have suggested, how we get segregation coming about. Here's a few that I'm going to I'll just kind of go through briefly, and in particular I want to say, well, what implications would they have for these different units of analysis, whether we're talking about whether it's the racial ethnic composition of the household or the micro neighborhood or the broader neighborhood that matter. There's the place stratification theory, the household preferences theory, which is this idea of people having a preference what the racial ethnic composition of the people that live near them are. Place stratification is the notion more that race matters even above and beyond the economic resources we have. Differential economic resources is more the classic assimilation model idea that as people gain economic resources, you'd see less segregation, and whatever you do see is just driven by this economic process. Discrimination and steering are the notion that you'd see access to certain units being denied or steered away from, if you will. Social networks, the idea that there's this networking process that goes on, that somehow contacts are important for bringing about information about units. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about a bit here that I'm going to suggest, at least throw out there as a possible thing to think about, is signaling, an idea from economics. I'll get to that in a bit. So again, talking about each of these, what do they mean for these processes? Place stratification theory, if it is indeed the case that this process works, what we really should see arguably is that the racial ethnic composition of the broader neighborhood is what you would see mattering. This is much more of a larger structural theory. It doesn't focus so much on micro areas, micro neighborhoods, and that kind of thing as much. Household preferences, on the other hand, is a theory that gets a little more micro, as you might well imagine. Again, it's this idea of preferences. So preferences that are driving what the area looks like. So you might well think that the micro-composition of both the local area and the broader neighborhood would matter for someone's preferences. They wouldn't just look at their local block and then ignore the broader area. According to this theory, it'd be less reason perhaps to think that the household itself composition or the characteristics of the previous household would matter to them. But that's what we'd expect from that. This notion of differential economic resources, the classic assimilation model. Consequences, well, one, arguably if we account for economic resources, we shouldn't really see much other effect for race ethnicity, so it's of less interest to us here. Discrimination and steering, a bit trickier to think about. What are the consequences? Discrimination, it depends how you model this. What do you think, how the process works? If it works at the level of the housing unit, then that's where we would see it. We would see this process where there would be reduced likelihood that a housing unit would transition from a white household to a non-white household. So you wouldn't necessarily see it at the broader neighborhood or even the micro neighborhood, but it would happen right at the level of the housing unit. Steering, which is this notion of real estate agents playing this important role of guiding prospective residents to certain housing units, certain neighborhoods. What might matter there? Well, you might think that the composition of the micro neighborhood or the broader neighborhood would matter. Although originally I wrote this, as the more I've thought about it, could you make an argument that steering might happen based on the race ethnicity of the previous or the current occupants of the unit? Something that might occur, I don't know. It would require the real estate agent, knowing the race, ethnicity of the previous people, would they use that as a cue of who to show the unit to? If that were the case, you could see that process occur as well. Social networks, social networking, the idea of who people talk to, how they get information about different units, different neighborhoods. How would we see this process play out? You could think about it in a couple different ways. One, we might see that the composition of the micro neighborhood might matter, or we might see that the housing unit matters. The housing unit, you can imagine this process if people find out the availability of a unit. Someone's moving out of a unit, they send information out through their networks. We see this differential likelihood of networks being members of the same race, but then you could see that information going to people of the same race, ethnicity, and it could play out that way.
John?
Yeah.
Are you talking about both turnover in rental units and owner-occupied, or?
Yes, I'm mushing them together. That's a great point.
Okay.
But we could talk about that.
So it seems to me there might be
Yeah.
different processes.
Exactly. Yeah, that people have raised that, posed that, yeah. What are you thinking of? Anything in particular?
Well, the flow of information about finding out about
Yeah.
units, and both the process by which the next occupant is determined. Is it a real estate agent who's selling it?
Yeah.
Or a rental agent who's trying to fill it? So I think that there might be
Right.
differences.
Yeah. For the analysis here, this initial analysis was mushing them together, if you will. I was pushed in that direction of trying them. Some of the models I've tried differently didn't show too many differences, not as many as some people expected to see, not see them, but there's definitely a different process that goes on there, and we'll get to that in just a moment when I talk about this idea of signaling. When we start thinking about that, how that plays out in a rental or an owner process situation might be different. So it's definitely worth, yeah, it's to the extent that that plays out differently, that's an important empirical distinction to make in the model. And so the idea of the micro neighborhood is this idea of information you find out about others nearby. That could play out perhaps in a rental building. You know, you see a unit become available, you send out information to your network ties, and again, if they're more differentially, you're the same race ethnicity, you can see that process play out that way. And likewise, on the micro neighborhood, if you know a unit is available. The final idea that I'm kind of going through, that I'm going to kind of put out there as an idea to think about, is this notion of signaling. It comes from economics, and at root, it's this idea of information asymmetry. It's been used, initially it was proposed for labor markets. Those who are familiar with the idea, the classic case, the principal agent problem, where this person coming in wanting to get employment, knows I know how good a worker I am, but the person hiring me doesn't know that about me. They're trying to interview me, they're trying to figure out something about me, so they're looking for signals from me. What kind of a worker am I? And in the early literature, one idea was this idea of getting a degree, right? And a degree of some sort, economic. Freudian slip there.
Heaven forbid.
Heaven forbid. I have one, I'm happy. So you get this degree, and it's a sign of certain quality that you have. And that sends a signal to the potential employer. So again, it's this information asymmetry. It's popped up in other literature as well, having to do, basically anytime you can see this process come up. They've done it in the investment literature, it's popped up a bit there. One implication of it that then was raised early on by economists, this notion that you can get this sort of statistical discrimination. They pointed out if there's a tendency for one group to be poorer workers, well then if I see someone who's a poor worker, I can statistically infer that they're more likely to be a poor worker given their characteristics. So that is a potential problem that can pop up with that. I'm suggesting the same situation in a sense can occur here, that the person living in the housing unit knows more about it than I do as a potential person moving in. I'm trying to figure that out, right? It's like buying a car, right? You're trying to figure out what kind of shape is it in. And as well, they know more about the neighborhood. than me as the prospective person moving in. And again, I'm kind of a detective. I'm trying to figure that out. A lot of my work focuses on crime, and there you can see the same potential thing becoming an issue. Someone who lives in the neighborhood knows they may have seen things happening. It seems like the neighborhood's going downhill. Me, as someone coming to consider the unit, has less information about that. I'm trying to pick that up. I'm looking for signals, right, if you will. Maybe I'm looking for disorder or that sort of thing if I'm interested, being concerned about crime. If for some reason I have a particular preferences about race, ethnicity, would I use the race, ethnicity of the current household as a potential signal for something like that? What it would suggest to me, it might suggest that A, this is an indication of the race, ethnicity of the area, perhaps. It's a crude estimate, but other than me going door to door, walking around trying to see what the race, ethnicity is of people, it might be one simple clue. Or another idea is that even if it's a racially, ethnically mixed neighborhood, this might be a sign to me that, you know, this is a welcome area for someone of my race, ethnicity, if that was something, for whatever reason, I was concerned about.
John, I have to get, because you just mentioned something that I was interested in some of the earlier versions, where if I have a preference for living in a neighborhood that has people of this race and not people of that race,
yeah.
How do those theoretical approaches deal with the information problem? How do I find out what the races of the people in the neighborhood are? I can't go door to door. They're not necessarily standing out on their porch steps. How are you supposed to? I mean, clearly, if I lived in the neighborhood long enough, I would eventually see people leave their houses unless they live in a suburb and I only ever see their cars.
Yeah.
You know? But how am I supposed to find out about this as a potential home buyer? I can't ask.
I mean, it's an excellent question. I don't know. Are there people in here who know have a sense of that? It's Greg, yeah.
Years ago, they did the National Survey of Black Americans, and they were especially interested in trying to find black families in largely white neighborhoods. And it was an incredibly reliable process to ask any white resident if there were any black residents in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So it's not, if that's the kind of search you're interested in, it's not that difficult once you start to just ask a few questions.
Okay, I guess that's the question is, like, as a potential home buyer, is that something that people feel is politically okay to ask somebody, or does that sound like a racist thing to ask? So are there any black people in this neighborhood? I mean,
Right.
can you imagine asking somebody that?
Right.
Yes, actually.
That's why you get a real estate agent, right?
And then the real estate agent finds those things out.
Well, the real
somehow.
estate agent knows the neighborhoods, right?
If they do, yeah.
Well, that's their business too.
but it's illegal for them to tell you.
Right, but they can show you certain houses and they can say,
It's
okay.
illegal if you want.
That it violates the Fair Housing Act because it's steering if you start talking about the racial composition or the crime level.
But they could talk about the school district and the other amenities in the neighborhood. Okay.
That's all economic.
Anyway, if you're a sociologist, you do that.
I mean, you touch on, I mean, that is true, and the crime is interesting because as a little side note, I study crime in neighborhoods and I'm trying to collect data. And a lot of cities, some cities will provide it on the web, others won't. And I think the concern is just that people will use that as a cue for inferring something else from it. But it's a tricky question now how you would determine that. Yeah, a real estate agent presumably would know that, but their information would be imperfect, I suppose. So, then the question is, well, there might even be a question someone posed. I've said that, given this talk before, and someone immediately shot back, oh, no way do people know the race, ethnicity of previous residents, which I don't know. I've heard it with such assuredness that it kind of, oh God, maybe I don't know something here. How could people know it, or how could they infer it? One, you might meet them. It's very possible that you meet the previous residents. Two, they might be described by the real estate agent in some way. Three, I pose this sort of joking, the new residents may be cultural anthropologists. I say half jokingly, but maybe not, right? We may be better than we realize, and there's interesting evidence about this, but if you go walking through a house, can you tell the race, ethnicity of the people living there? Susan mentioned an interesting, what's this little museum up in San Francisco you're telling me?
Oh, it's called the Exploratorium. It's a kids' science museum, essentially. But one of the exhibits there gives you pictures of a house, and it says, "Can you guess who lives here?" And they'll give you, some Latina woman. They'll give you, say, an Asian couple, or pictures of people who are very different, and then they'll show you the house, and you have to guess by the clues. And one will have a picture of Milagros on it, so let's see who might live there. Or another will have pictures on the refrigerator that are of an Asian family. Well, let's see who might live there. And you could very easily guess who lived in what kind of house. And so it's an exhibit in the museum.
How common is staging? I mean, like for home sales, like
that's a key question.
Yeah.
That's a key question.
So I know in the Bay Area, you don't sell a house without having it staged.
And describe that. What is staging?
So basically, you have a professional come in, take all your stuff out, and bring in stuff to make your house look appealing.
Better furniture.
Right.
And it's appealing to sort of a certain kind of. I mean, so there again, it's a certain kind of buyer.
It's still a cultural.
Appeal to.
Yeah.
But it's sending a certain kind of signal, right? And they say, my understanding is they take all the pictures, all family pictures out, and I mean they might if they're really good, they might bring in pictures of the prospective buyers' families and put them up.
Right.
Really well.
How common is that up there? Do you know?
It's pretty much universal.
I'm trying to get this data set I'm using back would be the 80s into the very early 90s. Do you suppose that was going on back then? Do you know? That's something I kind of need to get a sense of to what extent, if that is indeed prominent now, that would pose a bit of a problem for this. But
I know the rental market was tighter in the early 90s, but I don't know about the buying market.
Yeah. Okay. So again, how might we do this? Different ways. Photos in the wall, unless it's been professionally staged. Magazines lying about, right? Magazines are an interesting cultural reference, and the type of magazines that people read can give you a clue. The art, the music that's sitting around. Decorations that are up and about. Empirical evidence of this is a book back in the early 80s. So again, using late 1970s data, found that 96% of respondents knew the race ethnicity of the previous residents. So we're pretty strong empirical evidence. Now, does that still hold now? That's something, now we're...
That's after the fact, right?
That's after the fact, yeah. After the fact. Yeah, whether it holds now is another question as well. I'll just briefly talk about previous work that is focused on the same idea of housing unit transition. Marullo did a study back, again, using the same data set as what I'm going to be using here, showing transitions in housing units, but didn't take into account the context at all. So he was just focused on this narrow question: do white people tend to replace other white people, Asians replace Asians, etc., and found really strong homophily. But again, not taking into account the context. Rosenbaum and colleagues, using New York City data, have done a number of studies. But there, they've done the housing unit, but then they've also taken into account a context. But for them, their neighborhoods, if you will, as they term them, are 100,000 people or more, which you can argue is a pretty big neighborhood. Regardless of how dense New York City is, it's still pretty darn big. Ellen used census tracts and as the context, and found this effect. Again, the racial ethnic composition of the tract affected who moved in, and at the same time she still found this same household effect. Even controlling for the composition of the tract, there was still this effect where people of the same race tended to replace one another. In there, she speculated that she wasn't sure if this was entirely a household thing. It could be the micro neighborhood as well that's driving that. And indeed, with my data, that's what I'm going to be able to tease out. We're going to be able to take into account characteristics in the micro neighborhood. Sam Friedman has a forthcoming paper looking at micro neighborhoods and tracts, and then studies of racial ethnic preferences. It's interesting to point out that they've shown these cards to people, and the cards are basically a micro neighborhood, right? And that's sort of, and then it's interesting to juxtapose that with the segregation literature that uses tracts. So certainly the preferences have focused on a real small unit, so I'm going to try to measure that here. The data, again, the American Housing Survey, the neighborhood subsample. This was drawn in 3 years, 1985, 89, and 93. They did this extra little sample. I didn't even put the numbers on there, did I? I have to do this. I've done this so many times. How many are there? There's over 670 micro neighborhoods, I think, in 85, and then they supplemented that in 89 and 93 with new micro-neighborhoods that came along. So I've got 2 move periods. I can study people moving from 85 to 89. Do they move? 89 to 93. And movement being just, does the head of the household change over that 4-year time period? So I don't know. I mean, just at the beginning and the end, I don't know how many moves or anything like that. And so I'm going to have 3 outcome measures, if you will, that I'm looking at, basically looking at the race, ethnicity of the new residents in the unit. Are they white? Are they Latino? Are they African American?
Can I clarify, you said that the head of household changed. Could the head of household only have moved out and the rest of the household stays the same?
I don't know.
I mean, they get divorced and
Right.
leaves and the rest of the family's still there. That's not really a household unit change, but it would be a change of head of household.
Well, that's a tricky one. Yeah, leave it to a family person to point that out. You're right. That's an excellent point. Yeah, so how did that happen? I have to check if that gets caught or not in that case. I'm banking usually they all move. I got to check on that. That could be not quite right. Most of the time. So again, focusing only on households who move. In these, over the 2 years, 5,700 moves we have. I don't know if I think I do mention here, we did do some models accounting for the non-movers, and they don't change our results at all. Our independent variables, we're most interested at the household level, the race, ethnicity of persons, white, black, Latino, and other. The other category is pretty small. Again, this is the mid-'80s. This area, there's just not enough Asians or other groups to look at them at all meaningfully. Micro-neighborhood and tract. In each of those, we include the percent white, black, Latino, and other. In tracts, we can split out Asians because there's enough variability to do that are not so in the micro-neighborhoods. We also include a measure of the racial ethnic mixing, the heterogeneity, based on Herfindahl index.
How do you operationalize micro-neighborhood?
Micro-neighborhood, yeah, good point. I ran through that. This American Housing Survey follows housing units over time. And what they did in 1985, they came along, they randomly polled about selected 670 of these units. And then what they did is for each of those units, they went and they interviewed the 10 closest units to them. That's what they have. So you have this center point and then the 10 closest. I've actually read through this geeky documentation exactly how they do it. It's based, they don't go over a railroad track, but it's whoever's closest, they go around the block, sort of thing. If it's in an apartment structure, come back to there, they'll, there's a real complicated thing, but they'll do all the people on the same floor. If there's 20 on the same floor, then you'll have 20 people in the micro-neighborhood. If it's less, if there's 5, then they'll go down. I think they go downstairs and upstairs.
So having lived, I was going to ask about your upstairs and downstairs neighbors, because those are the ones you meet first, right?
Or here first.
Or here first.
Yeah. If you live by the stairs, never mind infesting you, right? Yeah.
So that's pretty much exactly what you want for a micro-neighborhood. Right?
Yeah. In a sense, yeah. It's pretty darn close. Yeah. Amazing. And it's the data set has not been used very much. It's something I stumbled along. I grabbed it for my dissertations when I started working on it. I did the analyses at the U.S. Census has these census data centers, and I did the work there. A little bunker, either no sunlight, anything like that. Other controls that take into account income stability, crowding, perceived crime, other neighborhood characteristics, school quality, bars and liquor stores, that kind of thing, just to account for, maybe these are sort of spurious things that are driving it. Not many of them have much of an interesting effect, but we did that. The models are just logit models with corrected standard errors for this clustering. I did do multi-level logit models, but the results were similar. There's some estimation issues with a logit with SAS. This whole it's ugly mess where you have to use starting values. Results can be different and the whole thing. There's and we're limited in the census data center that all you have is SAS there. So the results were the same. So I'm just going to present those results. Multiple imputation for missing data, and as I kind of alluded, we did do a Heckman selection model, including the inverse Mills ratio to take into account non-movers. The results were very similar, extremely similar. So it didn't have much of an effect. Let me show you a few of the results. what we found. First question again, asking is the new household black that's moving into the unit? Talking about predicted probabilities. So here, again, the question, if the black household replaces a white household. This previous unit had a white household. Now, what is the probability that the new household will be black, is what we're asking here. And for this, to look at the effects in these different micro-neighborhoods, we start picking the average micro-neighborhood racial composition for black residents in the sample entirely. So so that's the, we start with that as the baseline, if you will, and there the predicted probability is 0.48, that a black household will replace a white household that was living in that micro-neighborhood. Now, if you increase the percent white in that local micro-neighborhood 1 standard deviation, that probability drops to 0.23. If you increase the percent Latino, similar amount, it drops to 0.32, so not dropping quite as much. And conversely, yeah, go ahead, Greg.
So this can't be of all the white, original white households, what fraction switch?
No.
That's going to be an incredibly small number, right? So
yeah, of all the white, right? That would be a different thing. Yeah, doing yeah.
What is this? I don't understand that. What's the 0.48, for example?
That would be, that is going to be the predicted probability. If we had a white household living in an average, a micro-neighborhood that has the racial composition of the average black, there's not, and for one thing, you imagine there aren't a lot of white houses there, because that off the top of your head, you say that's kind of surprisingly big, somewhat of a big number. Why would it be almost a 50% chance that it would switch to black? That would be, in a sense, be a bit of an indicator of this sort of process we see, that white households living around more blacks are more likely to leave, and then more likely to be replaced by blacks. So that's what it's that white household living in that context. Then what is the probability that the new residents will be
John,
black?
that average is about what, 12%, 13, 15%?
Say that what?
The average is 15%. What is that value? The average micro neighborhood.
Oh, what is the racial composition of that?
Right. And what's the? So what you're saying is, like, if this is like 15% black, this neighborhood, and then you have point.
No, it's much more than that, because it's the average micro-neighborhood of a black resident in the sample. So it's not the average
of all
micro-neighborhood, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's the average context of a black household.
Oh, okay. So to put that in context. Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So it's a bit, yeah, you could, right, how to present the results, you could, it's.
And then the 0.8 that would look really high, right?
Yeah. Right. And that, so you can, yeah, as you can well imagine, the numbers are going to vary. It's particularly going to vary when I get to tracks, because we've got this, it turns out there is this heterogeneity effect, particularly for blacks. We don't see it as much for the other groups, but we do see it for them. And then so then it's going to matter whether you're at a low percentage or a higher percentage is going to make a difference. So it's not a straight linear effect, basically, is what we get. And at the micro-neighborhood level, again, if it's more, a higher percentage black, then the probability of that transitioning from a white to a black household is even that much greater.
And what would those numbers be if, or maybe I'm anticipating where you're going, but if that was a black household that was being replaced?
Oh, a black replacing another black household?
Yeah, in the average black.
I should just show you these. Lost it. Did I show that or not? I don't think you can see this, maybe. Maybe so. Here's, yeah, here, the number is 0.87.
Okay.
Yeah. If it's, so it's 0.48 chance if it's white, 0.37 if it was Latino, 0.87 if it's black for that. And so I don't know if it's easier to follow this or the other one, which you can see better, but so that's this micro-neighborhood context. We see this kind of straightforward effect. For tracks, we actually see little effect for from in movement of a black household, and again, it's because of this heterogeneity effect that where you are here we're starting with a tract that's relatively high percentage black, so when you push it up higher, it doesn't have much of an effect at all. Probability is still 0.48, of course, but when you increase percent white, there's hardly a change, Latino hardly a change, and percent black going up, it's even less of a likelihood. So blacks tend to be being pushed more into heterogeneous tracts.
Are standard deviation changes comparable at those two levels? Can you relate?
No, they're a little different. They're a little different. I chose to go with standard deviation change because the argument being that this represents really the amount of change, because there, as you're intuiting, there's always going to be more, no, always, I think I can say always, nearly always going to be more variability at the micro neighborhood than at the tract. This tract's a larger aggregation, so it's not going to move as much. Yeah.
So that makes it a little bit hard to think about 0.46, right?
Either way, yeah, it's a tough question to back up and say, well, what number do we want to get it?
Right.
Do we want, because a 10% change in each are different things. So I don't know if that's comparable. So I went with this. Either way, if you push it more, it's not going to make a big change. It's still going to be, if we double that, it's going to push it down even a little bit more. So it won't make that much of a change. Again, this is the only one where we found this effect. Now, controlling for that neighborhood, micro neighborhood, do we see the same race effect? Yes, and it's actually extremely strong, even controlling for these. Here, just presenting these as odds ratios. Compared to previous household being black, the odds are reduced of this new household being black. 86% of the previous were white, and 91% of the previous household was Latino. So still a gigantic effect, controlling for the tract, controlling for the micro neighborhood. Still something going on about the race ethnicity of the housing unit. And the pattern of results, very similar in general for the other two racial ethnic compositions, people moving in. Here asking is a new household white, and here the micro neighborhood, a white household replacing a Latino. I chose this one rather than going through that whole table I had before, although I got that for people who want to come through that. And the average micro neighborhood, 0.31 chance that a white household will replace a Latino. If you increase the percent black or Latino, that probability goes down quite a bit. If you increase the percent white, it goes up. So again, a fairly substantial micro neighborhood effect. But here we also see a stronger effect for tracts for white. So at the same time, controlling for them at the same time going on, the average is 0.31. Again, increasing the percent black or Latino goes down even more. And again, this is a little less of a percentage change. So it would be even more if we did an equal percent change. And then whites going up even more.
So that's enormously more important, right? The tract level than micro neighborhoods for whites and blacks.
Yeah, for whites and blacks, absolutely. Blacks it had almost no effect.
Right.
Depends, yeah, where you're at. You can see a bit of effect if it was a low percentage blacks. But for whites, yeah, it's a huge effect.
So here it'd be interesting to look at home ownership, right, versus renting. Because if you're interested in house value, you might be interested in a larger neighborhood measure.
Larger area. Yeah, it's important. Yeah, if you see blocks changing. That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. I'll go back to looking at that one. Nonetheless, even controlling for there's huge effects for tract and micro neighborhoods, still a huge effect for the housing unit race ethnicity. Again, it's 80%. Odds are reduced 80% if the prior household was black or Latino. So finally, looking at is new household Latino, similar pattern to for blacks. Same story that it goes down if you increase the percent white or black, and the micro neighborhood goes up, increase percent Latino. So again, the same race effect. Tracts were similar kind of pattern going on there. So you can plot out this reinforcing effect if you increase the percent, one standard deviation increase in percent white in the micro neighborhood and the tract. This probability of 0.25 goes down to 0.06, so it's a big drop. Same way with percent black, drops quite a bit. So reinforcing, even though it's just a linear or an additive effect, but it's still strong when you combine the two. But again, this strong household level effect.
Do we know a fraction of people moving in know the people they're replacing? Has anyone asked about that?
I don't know. That's been, people have posed that. If people know of literature, I've been scouring the literature trying to find sort of, I've asked people about this. I've not found much. I found that, I found a couple sites that talked about after the fact. Do people know, the race ethnicity of people, but whether they've met them or not, I don't know.
Because that might account for some of the huge effects that are showing up at the individual unit.
What do you mean?
Well, if you're recruiting the replacement would play a role, and your own network is very same race, same ethnicity.
Right. So as that was my disclaimer coming into this, I'm looking at patterns here, and in a sense, it leaves off, in some ways, a bigger question. Why is this? And I've not seen literature looking at it. So to me, it's a natural direction to go to try to figure out some of these things. To what extent do people know, who was in the unit, etc. Just a couple quick comments on the control variables. Income, higher income in the micro neighborhood increased the probability that a white household will move in, less likely to have a Latino household move in. Income in the tract had no effect. Residential stability in the micro neighborhood also increased the probability that a white household will move in, and lowered the probability that a black household will move in. So these more stable local areas. The tract had no effect. One final thing I tried doing a little bit is, again, following up on this signaling idea. Like someone said, oh, people don't really know the race ethnicity of people, how would they know? And then it becomes a question, well, maybe there's certain contexts where it's more important to me to know. I mean, you can imagine certain people care more than others. Some don't care at all. Some might be somewhat concerned about it. The people who are concerned might be particularly concerned in certain contexts, is where it becomes important for them to figure out this, use this signaling information. So I tried a couple things, interactions, kind of contextual things. Residential stability, thinking that there might be less signaling information in a case like this, because there's a large amount of change going on anyway. So you'd figure all this change going on, the present household is less of an indicator of the household. They just haven't had a chance to move out. They might be getting ready to leave. So it's not as strong a signal. Racial ethnic composition. This may, again, leaving aside Joy's question of how do you know what the race ethnic composition is, you trust your real estate agent, that might really increase, for whatever reason, the salience of this to you, and you might use that signaling more. Or the economic environment might be important. There's less uncertainty, perhaps. If I'm going into a high-income neighborhood, I'm probably safe to assume it's a pretty quality neighborhood. A lower-income one, it might be more dicey. Maybe it's a nice, cohesive neighborhood that's just a little lower income, or maybe it's a really problematic one. So there, I might want to use the signaling much more. Test these out. For stability, we do see somewhat of an effect at looking again at that micro neighborhood. There's no effect for the tract, but looking at these interactions, what effect do they have on this same race effect for the household? Neighborhoods with more stability, micro neighborhoods with more stability, the white to black transition, another 34% less likely. So even less likely to see that transition occur when you see a lot of stability in the micro neighborhood. And likewise, Latino to white transition, 20% less likely, again, in a very stable micro neighborhood. So again, somewhat consistent with that idea. Asking about the racial ethnic composition, if you increase the percent black in the micro neighborhood or the tract, either one, black to white transition, another 35% less likely. More Latinos in the micro neighborhood or tract, again, Latino to white, another 34% less likely. So again, we know before that whites seem to be more affected by the broader area. Here, we're seeing it seems to affect this same race effect even more. Income had no effect. Thought it would, but it didn't. One last thing we tried was looking at the broader context. Our reviewer said, oh, look at central city areas. That turned out not to have an effect, but we thought, well, central city, really what that is a proxy for when people talk about what they mean, low income, high crime. We tried race as well. It doesn't have an effect, but it's such a big context. But we do see a strong effect for violent crime and income. And it turns out, if you look at the county violent crime rate, that does in fact affect this same race transition. The transition from white to black decreases, it's a weird phrasing, white to black transition. The odds decrease 40% of seeing this transition, or black to Latino Again, that decreases quite a bit for a high violent crime county, so in that larger context. And flip, you see the same thing if you look at the lower income counties. Same thing, white to black decreased, black to Latino decreased. So again, in these broader contexts, either high crime or lower income, that same race effect is the same. Almost out of time. So let me quickly kind of summarize what I've been showing here. What does this mean? So we see this strong, household effect that persists even controlling from micro neighborhood and the broader tract. That's kind of inconsistent with some of these models. The place stratification, the preferences, classic assimilation. There's something else going on here. Of course, the strong micro neighborhood effects also imply that stratification, assimilation, signaling model doesn't account for that, but we still see this micro neighborhood effect as well. Of course, it's possible that there's more than one of these going on, quite likely. The micro neighborhood effects are consistent with some of these theoretical models, preferences, steering, networking. It could be that the case, but which one is at work? I can't say here. It's more, again, looking at patterns. Again, it's possible that more than one is at work. So again, that might be something for future research to kind of look at. And again, this question, what is the important context, which I started with, this idea of trying to pick out what seems to be an empirical pattern, what reveals itself based on behavior. There's still this question of exactly how does it work, what do people look at. I mean, both the micro neighborhood and the tract appear important, especially for whites. But again, this issue, the race ethnicity of the previous residents seems important, but I've seen there's not much literature out there talking about that. Or even these questions of how this might take place, how they know race ethnicity of people, how do they know that? Even there's not a lot of literature on that. And different theories that might explain it, we touched on this notion of social networks might be in effect. Whether that differs between homeowners and renters, I think is a useful direction to kind of look at and say that if that is indeed how it plays out. The steering effect could be the case, but it's hard to say. Do real estate agents play it? It's tricky to find that out because no one's going to admit or acknowledge that, right? So it's a real difficult thing to tease out. So just to conclude, the racial ethnic composition of the tract matters. So even though these little cards look at the local micro neighborhood, which does have an effect, and in fact, we found that for most groups it was almost stronger, but the tract did matter, especially for whites. The race ethnicity of the previous household still has a strong effect. And why? It doesn't seem like it's discrimination because we kind of saw it across the board. It's not just whites not transitioning to other groups. So it doesn't seem like it's that, but is it networks, is it signaling? It's not clear, but either way, it's something is going on, something worth studying more. So I'll conclude there. Thanks.
Did they just sample one micro neighborhood per tract?
Essentially.
So you never get enough multiple micro
at all.
neighborhoods?
There's like about 4 or 5 doubles. There's just no variance on that. Yeah.
Are these all urban areas, or I missed that?
I didn't say it. I should have. Barbara Ann Whistle back in Carolina would be jumping all over me. But it's urban and suburban, basically. So it's non-rural, is what they did. So they slopped off them, and then they did a random sample from the urban and suburban persons. Again, they were sampling those housing units and then building the micro neighborhood around them. And that was the sampling device. So then that's why it ends up that there's almost none that are 2 or more in the tract, which is nice for standard errors, but it's not great if you wanted to try to get at this additional variability going on.
So you know whether it's whether it's a rental unit or a home unit, right?
I do know that, yeah.
And it seems like there are a lot of reasons to want to do this separately.
Yeah.
Because it might help you to distinguish between some of your theories.
Yeah, I agree. I'm kicking myself. The reason I'm kicking myself now, well, for many reasons, but one of which is now this work I did back at Duke in their Census data center, and now to do the analyses now, I go up to UCLA And I first had to beg and plead with the census, and I have to show them I have an R&R, and I need you basically, I'll send the paper to you, Greg, critique it, give me an R&R, and say I need to go back. And with that, then I can go back. That's what I need, is I need that, and I can go back and say I need to redo these analyses. So, but it's something that's become starkly clear to me that at the time I thought, oh, it won't make that much of a difference, but that was a pretty, in hindsight, not a great decision. Because it makes sense that these processes would play out, at least potentially differently. I mean, I've got the public use data where I can't do the contextual effect, but I can look at same race transitions by renters versus owners there. And there were some differences there, not huge. But again, that's not really getting at what you really want to be testing. Because it's more this idea, some of these contextual effects we might well think would play out differently for those two groups. I don't know. I'm trying to think if that causes problems for estimation, but I'll set that aside.
Do you know how far people have moved? Do you know anything about whether it's a local, relatively local move or a distance move? I'm trying to think of the information that people would have available. And if most moves are relatively short distance.
Do we know how they found a unit?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I'm almost certain. I don't think they ask where they're coming. Because all I know is I don't know where the other people left, but I know the new people coming in. I mean, the people coming in, that's the question. I don't know how far they've come. I don't think I have that. I'm not 100% sure. I need to go look on that. They do ask questions about why you chose this unit. What characteristics of the neighborhood, what characteristics of the unit. And I'm trying to remember now if they asked, was this...
Like prior residents?
Yeah. I guess the main thing we'd probably want to know, I think where you're going with is, were they in the same metropolitan area or not? I think you could probably split it based on that. If you're in the same metropolitan area, you have relatively decent information. If you're coming from outside...
You might have a lot of things. You might have information, access to particular realtors. You might know the neighborhoods. You might also have the network connections.
Yeah, right. Whereas if you're coming from outside the metropolitan area, those things...
Right, and it might be a much grosser picture of what's going on. You might have heard about, this area, but not that one, but not down to
a real
street
fine-grained.
Camille Charles has done some work on this, and what she discovered was that whites had more information than blacks.
Interesting.
Just in general, you mean...
About the potential neighborhoods.
Either, you mean for people living in the same metro area, or even...
People in the same metro area.
Okay. So people coming from another metro area are kind of equally uncertain based on that, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's worth thinking about. Joy?
I guess I'm biased coming from the Detroit area, but I'm trying to think about what would be a lot of the concerns about these white movers who are thinking about moving into this neighborhood. Why are they concerned about whether there are minorities living there or not?
Yeah.
And one of the issues is this neighborhood is turning.
Yeah.
It's going downhill, and the property value is going to go down.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons you want to look at it. But I would think that you would see a really strong difference there in terms of if you have a high SES neighborhood that's clearly being kept up and clearly very wealthy, that in a sense it might matter less what the races of the people are than if it's a neighborhood that's more urban or more sort of questionable in a sense. So you're not really sure where it's going up or down.
Right.
So, but you said that you didn't see an income difference.
Yeah.
Is that income in terms of the individual person's income or the SES of the neighborhood or?
The neighborhood and micro neighborhood. Are you thinking, yeah.
So it just doesn't matter at all?
Not for those two. The micro neighborhood, I mean, measuring the average income in the micro neighborhood or the tract did not affect it. I thought the same thing. It seems pretty darn plausible to me, so I buy it.
And that's controlling for race, ethnicity, and crime and other things?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we test hypothesis.
Yeah. But I'm going to cling to it for the next 30 years and not give it up.
So I'm just curious, so one of the ideas is people, race is sort of socially salient, right? Sort of this idea of race as a master status or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Do you have other thoughts about, the one that sort of jumps to mind is language, right? Would be potentially really interesting to look at. I mean, I was thinking of other things like sexual orientation, potentially. Some neighborhoods sometimes, or class.
Yeah.
But I just wondering sort of what other kinds of information you might have that you could look at to potentially get information about. I mean, I don't know if like the different sort of group identities would give you different ideas in terms of like networks, discrimination, signaling.
Yeah.
But it seemed like there might be some leverage there.
So are you going? I suppose are you not thinking for this particular study? Is that what
No.
Yeah, right.
Like,
but
for the next 50
exactly
years,
right.
right.
Yes, that's no right. Thanks. I don't have enough to do. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, race to me, in some ways, is horrifically boring. Is what it's like. Oh my God, it's easy to measure. We kind of put it in, and it used to be tremendously important, and it's still somewhat important, no matter what we might want to think. But I think, there's a lot of reason to think that some of these other group identities would be important. And that signaling is getting fundamentally at that, right? I mean, that is, people in general, you move to a neighborhood, you want to get a sense of what's going on there. I was just talking to someone, they were saying there's someone we're trying to do a paper looking at gentrification. And how do you measure gentrification? Someone came up with a proxy, the number of Starbucks. Which I thought was interesting. That might be an easy way. You just drive around, lots of Starbucks, I'll move here. It's tricky though, but for other groups, how do you, for gays who, that would be a fascinating group to look at because they have, I don't know what the word is, but they've moved into all sorts of neighborhoods in all sorts of different cities, a real process. Like, how does that go on? I think some of that is, I'm speaking really off the top of my head, but I think there's been some pretty clear signals that are given at points there. But that, you can imagine how that plays out. And in some of those instances there, there's reasons like that would be pretty important to know that, perhaps, right? Some neighborhoods might be downright inhospitable. That, that would be a concern as well here. And so in that case, again, that signaling is even more important in how it plays out. So then it raises all these, raises these questions of how, are you just, in that case, are you just looking at the characteristics of the household? Probably not in that case, if we're talking about a case of transition. Right, because presumably the people moving out are going to be different than those moving in, so then it doesn't hold up as well.
Well, and you're looking at margin-free measures, right? So, like, because I think like one of the things, like, if you have like more immigrants coming in or something like that, like that's essentially that's going to be taken into account. Because the likelihood of a white to Latino transition is going to be increasing, but that's not going to show up in there if I understood your models correctly.
I have to think about it. I know it. I need to think about that because I don't want to. Because I know, that's a huge issue for like a lot of the segregation stuff like it. Because certain movement in, you're going to see some patterns are just a mathematical identity.
Right.
I don't think that's a problem here, but I'm not going to commit to that, especially since it's on tape.
I wonder if you looked at other household members like children. I would imagine that people that have small or school-age children that are different dynamics, or at least they would consider different options when moving in.
Right.
Like schools.
That's a great point. Other stuff I've done, I've looked at mobility out and looking at crime. Does crime matter? And for some of my work has found that crime does matter. But you do see this strong pattern in here that those with children less than 5 years are more likely to move. Those with children 6 to 18 years are less likely to move, and arguably that is the school factor. That's one simple story. Is the school story going on?
But also when they move, they would still have a place.
You're going. I know it, and it's funny because I rattled that off, and then no, I have not thought about that for this process. But why would it not work? Of course it would, but almost certainly, and that's an excellent point. And I've not looked at that, but
It just makes all the picture because they're really different from people who don't have kids and they might have totally different dynamics.
Those people with kids just mess everything up. The restaurants, it's noisy. Oh, it's a mess. Don't get me started.
John, our time is up. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.